So Peter and Jaromir from Avast. Again on DDoS, but again with the country with a C letter. You have the floor. Thank you.
Hello, welcome. Um, Chinese chicken, multi-platform DDoS botnets. The first part of the title will be explained later. The second part is saying about our topic. So we will focus on binaries that are for Linux operating systems for various platforms that are responsible for flooding attacks. Yesterday we have heard talk by Nick Sullivan. He explained in details the flooding methods and trends in 2014. Now we will show which binaries could be responsible for part of those attacks. So we start with the history, basically what happened in past year. Then we bring some common characteristics of those binaries, and we show an example of advertisement and methods how attackers accomplished infection of systems and making their tools working. And then we in details describe the main and most important families, Elknot and Bill Gates, Mr. Black, IP table, SX, XOR Ghost Rat, and we conclude with some statistics and victim preferences. So our first reference is a talk from Virus Bulletin 2011 in Barcelona. It says something about contemporary Chinese DDoS malware, but all of those were for Windows platform. Our story started in November 2013 when the first builder arrived on our backend that was able to produce Linux flooding bots. Actually, we did not notice that at that time. In November 2013, a few articles started to appear on the web that referred to hacked web servers with these tools. Then in December 2013, Malware Must Die summarizes those reports in this article. In February 2014, security researcher Waldick SS firstly mentioned a bot with strings Bill and Gates in the binary. In March 2014, we referred to the previous research as Elknot malware family. This is the first mention of Elknot on Twitter, I guess. In May 2014, Dr. Webb published again some blog about the DDoS Trojans for Linux, and it was mentioned. Mr. Black was mentioned for the first time. Then a few blog posts from Kaspersky came, and one of those also explained infection vector. Two reports from Prolexic in September 2014 about IP table SX and Mr. Black malware family were published, and in these reports we could have seen also some numbers of volume of these threats. At this period already, Malware Must Die published plenty of articles related to these kind of attacks. So perhaps the attention of security researcher were already caught. Meanwhile, ESET published a report of some APT with Windows Ghost Rat behind. And now we are infection chain.
Okay, so let's look at the infection chain. So basically, we started with one compromised server on which the attackers installed one service or one program, which was HTTP file server, and on this server, okay, is it better now? So on this compromised server, the attackers uploaded a bunch of files which were later downloaded and shared by the botnet. And among these files, we found a lot of interesting binaries, a lot of interesting text strings, some of binaries belong to Linux, some of them belong to Windows. So this was a very good source of information. So basically, these binaries were, in some cases, ELF malware pieces, which were compiled by the custom bot builders. Among these binaries, we could also find some hacking tools like various port scanners and so on. Interesting thing was that some of these binaries we were testing them only in virtual machines because some of them were infected by file infectors. Like, we don't know if it is by mistake or just if there was some intention of the attackers. So in the beginning, attackers run port scanners on various IP ranges, and depending on open ports which are opened, they might identify the services which were running on these machines, and depending on the services, they tried various types of exploits. Some of them were related to Elasticsearch, Shell Shock, Apache Struts, and Tomcat. Some vulnerabilities for Windows. They used various vulnerabilities for privilege escalation. Some of these vulnerabilities are mentioned in this slide. This was just one method. They used the exploit, and the second method was just SSH brute force attacks. So basically, they had two lists, or they had lists of passwords and lists of names, and they were trying to all the possible combinations until they logged into the machines which they wanted to compromise or not. Interesting thing is that many of these attacks were run from Windows machines, but they were targeting the Linux servers. These are examples of some of these tools which we found on these file sharing services. These are examples of port scanners. The first one is the port scanner completely written in a graphic or in interface completely in Chinese, where the attackers specify the IP range and ports they should be scanned, and then they run the process itself. They also use some like available third-party port scanners like WinEggDrop. This is the example of login and password brute forcers. The right one they called SSH 2.1. It was like used for like brute forcing Linux machines. The other one is called dubrute. It was targeting the Windows server machines. In some of these archives on these compromised machines, we found a list of IP ranges which they were targeting, and we found also files with password lists. You can see it on this slide. And also in one case, we found some results of these port scanning processes. So we can see that they scanned a few millions of addresses for the port 22, and when it was opened, it was ready for like another attacks.
Let's talk about common characteristics of those binaries that we have seen. So basically, all of them, those were Trojanized flooding tools, and they contained resources for Chinese locale. Some of these variants were written in C++ because we have seen objects and classes. Debug info were not stripped, and all these Trojan families supported similar flooding methods. And communication protocol was based usually on 1-byte grammar. And all these families were coming with a script that was responsible for killing competing processes that could consume resources. What we have seen was a fact that these binaries were not often in plain form, but sometimes they were coming packed with UPX, and not often with the usual UPX as we are used to. Some of the files have modified the UPX magic, which is UPX exclamation mark. A sample connected to Mr. Black family was altered in a way that all three checksums were incorrect, and the official unpacking tool UPX with the parameter D is very sensitive to these values because of not producing invalid data. Another family, IP table SX, was altered in even more complicated way, And what we have to say is that this original UPX tool does not recover even with one change that we mentioned here. And the second thing is that the dynamic behavior is not altered at all. So at this slide we will see three pictures. The picture at the top is the beginning, is the head of the file of an ELF executable. It is a 32-bit binary. At the picture in the middle we see the original tail section of this file with UPX header, peg header data. And at the picture at the bottom we see which modifications had to be made just to make the official UPX tool work for this sample. So we see that there's about five modification, and for certain it's not a coincidence. Actually, this file is requesting 64-bit method from the official tool, unpacking tool, but it is a 32-bit binary, so of course the official tool would fail because it would read from wrong offsets. A few checksums are altered. Now let's show an example of advertisement of this flooding tool. This is in Chinese, so let's see a translation. I would stress a sentence, customize a variety of attack software and source code generator. Favorable price, we come to inquire, and QQ contact below. And now switch to tools.
Okay, so let's look at the first flooding tool, which is named Elknot. It was characterized by presence like some configuration files with the kind of specified file names like fake.cfg or xmi.ini, and this tool was ported to many different several different operating systems and architecture, including Linux 32-bit, 64-bit, Windows 32-bit, also 64-bit version, FreeBSD version. All these tools have in common one thing, that they are very simple grammar for communicated with CNC server, which supports basically 4 simple commands. One is the start flooding task, the second one is to stop it, the third one is to write a fake configuration, and the last command is just sending status or current status back from the infected machine to CNC server. So these are examples of bot builders which attackers used to create new binaries with different configurations. So the first one is the first bot builders. We name them text box builders because they are very simple. They only contain 1 or 2 text boxes with where the attacker specifies the address of CNC server, and in one case they also can specify the port, and after pressing the build it creates the binary which is responsible for DDoSing. Interesting thing is that all these tools are Windows executable, and they produce the Linux binary, which is packed in UPX and which has hard-coded configuration inside of them. The next builder, which we call the chicken builder, is the most advanced builder. The name chicken is given after the thing that it produces some binaries which contain the string chicken in their debug strings, and this builder is much more complex and it can produce a lot of different binaries. On the right side you can see that it supports many different architectures. On the left side is generator for command and control panels, where the attackers can specify, for example, a restriction for MAC address, so the panel cannot run like on any machine, but only on machine with the specific MAC address. So the tool for Linux, when it starts, first it needs to collect some statistics from the infected machine. These statistics are later displayed on the command and control panels. So in case of Linux, it goes to several files in pros directory, and it reads and parses some information from them. The interesting information are, for example, the CPU frequency, or like the amount of CPU cycles which are consumed on the machine, or also they are interested in the bandwidth or the amount of bytes which are like data which are coming through the network on the machine. So before we mention that the configuration is hard-coded into binary, so In case of this hard coding, it's not written directly, but there is simple encryption. So basically we have the string, and in the beginning the decryption algorithm takes the string, and from the first byte it subtracts number 1, from to the second byte it adds 1, and so on. It continues until it decodes the port and IP address of the CNC server. The statistics which I mentioned before, in case of Linux, it was parsing several files in pros directory. In case of Windows, it needs the same information, but it needs to use different methods to get this data. So it uses performance monitors to get the number of bytes which flow like through the network. It also needs to go to registry and get some other information like CPU frequency. So this is the example with where the string chicken is located in debug information. So basically, when these tools infects the system, it creates the directory in program files. It names itself with suspicious name like svchost.exe, and the dropper has two different versions, one for 32-bit, one for 64-bit version. In all possible cases, or in most cases, it installs just 32-bit version. 64-bit version is run only or dropped or installed only on systems which are 64-bit only, for example, Windows Server 2008. And in addition to the main file, it drops like two more files which are related to accessing the packets in the network, which are these two files are part of WinPCAP project. So these are examples of the command and control panels. So you can see two different panels. Both of them look more or less the same. In the middle there is the list of infected machines, and in the right one you can see that on the panel there is one infected machine. You can read its operating system, it's some other statistics which we parsed before, like CPU usage, flow on the network, and CPU frequency. And in the bottom part, you can see some controls through which the attackers can specify which attack should start. So we can see, like in this example, they can specify the IP address of the target. They can specify which kind of flooding attack they prefer. It's like SANE attack, UDP attack, and yeah. This is another CNC panel. This one was generated from the chicken builder. It is slightly more complex. It has a few more buttons, but again, the idea is always the same: the list of infected machines and the tasks which are performed. So the next tool which we would like to mention is Bill Gates. It's named after two files which it creates in temporary file. One of them is Bill log, and the second one is Gates log. So after it was named. In these files, it just stores some process IDs of itself. And this tool is basically, it's kind of extension of the previously mentioned Alknot flooding tool. It supports few more methods. I think we could mention like DNS amplification. We won't go into the details because it was mentioned yesterday in the presentation. And this tool also like installs itself or establishes the persistence. It's done by creating the script in etc directory. It also does some modification or adds some commands to crontab. It also kills some competing processes. So in the left part we can see that with certain intervals it kills some processes with certain names. On the right side it's done, it's the task, it's auto update. So basically each 2 hours it goes to one of these HTTP file servers, as we mentioned in the beginning, and downloads new binaries, and later it starts them again. The configuration is also hard-coded in the binary, but it's not as simple as in the previous case where there was only just subtracting and adding just one byte or one value from each byte. In this case, there is like custom implementation of RSA encryption, and here in this screenshot we can see that we run the sample in Linux debugger, and we found at some place that there were like few strings, and after the decryption we got the configuration data. The configuration data always also includes IP address, the port, and some other information like should there be persistence or not, and some kind of name suffixes. There's also a version of Bill Gates for Windows. You can see again the debug string is somehow similar to the version of Elknot. The dropper also has two versions, one for 32-bit, one for 64-bit version. But in this case, there is not just one file dropped, there is like one more file. So in case of 32-bit version, it drops two files, and one of them is the Flutter itself, and the second one is the binary which we identified to be the Agony rootkit, whose source code was published on one of these Chinese source code sharing websites in 2006. So this is for 32-bit version. For 64-bit version, which only also aims just 64-bit only systems like Windows Server 2008, it also drops like few more drivers related to packet filters, and it also drops like some binaries which we identified to belong to Safe Engine protection engine. And in the samples which we had, these protections were not implemented yet, but I think there is the plan to make it kind of more protected and harder for reverse engineers to look inside.
Okay, more families. Mr. Black, just a note, there's a report of some family called AES DDoS, and we think that it is a subfamily of this one. This family could be characterized by presence of string version X, Mr. Black hacker, deal with DDoS, and so on. It is very robust because it supports a variety of flooding procedures. For example, CC flood is HTTP get attack. And also it is the most flexible one because it was compiled for variety of platforms, 32 and 64-bit Linux, MIPS, ARM, and also Windows. But by those exotic platforms, we may infer that the attackers try to attack server routers, Internet of Things devices, or ARM servers, and so on. At a proxy report, this family is connected with attacks that peaked at 215 gigabits per second. Another family, IP table SX, it comes with an extensive list of processes that is needed to kill. We highlighted groups that are connected with Elknot that are highlighted with green color. The red color are names of processes for Bill Gates, and there are some general process names, Minerd, highlighted with blue. This family is definitely a Trojan because it achieves its persistence in the boot directory. It supports two methods, synflood and DNS flood, and also it has an ability to self-update. A 32-bit variant for Windows usually come with names IP tables exe and get set up exe. Okay, this is an interesting family, XOR DDoS. It was reported by Malware Must Die at the end of September 2014. It is more advanced Trojan for 32 and 64-bit Linux. It creates persistence by installing itself into the boot directory under the random name. It supports also two flooding methods, and it is named after the presence of a constant called XOR keys, which is used to decrypt strings present in the binary. We have seen those strings in plain form. Unfortunately, the URL was not available at the time of our research. But what is really interesting about this one is that it contained an embedded rootkit, which was not reported at the end of September because it was not implemented that time. Rootkit features contain hide file, hide ports, hide TCP4, TCP6 ports, the same for UDP, and also some firewall modifications. And the Trojan communicates from user space with this rootkit which exists in the kernel via IO control command with some specific code. This is an analogy to Windows API function device IO control. And finally, Ghost Thread. This is an infamous family. It exists out there for ages, but we need to stress that it is only for Windows. Its source code is shared on Chinese websites, and also there's a huge number of samples connected with this thread. And the presence of strings chicken and hacker make our reason even more to name our talk like Chinese chicken. On the picture, basically, there's a CNC panel, and this is not just the flooding tool, it supports more backdoor capabilities. Okay, let's talk something about statistics. Actually, there's always it's hard to measure botnet if you do not have access to the CNC panel, but actually, these bots were connected with HFS servers, and these servers store number of downloads. This number, 37,000 almost downloads of some file that was Bill Gates, actually does not represent the botnet size because it is just an upper bound because of that self-updating capability. Another panel with some huge numbers, and there were plenty of more these HFS servers running these bots. So these botnets could be quite large. Okay, this word map represents the preference of file names for those ELF bots. Actually, the larger the font is, the higher number of unique samples is connected to that name, so we can recognize the IP table SX family and names for Bill Gates. All those small names are connected with Elknot, coming from bot builders. There was a huge variety of naming Elknot bots, and I would point to 3502. That is the download name for XOR DDoS Trojan. Okay, victim preferences. We monitored botnets for a while, and we have seen that mostly small and medium-sized businesses are under attack. So online gaming sites, casinos, e-commerce shops, forums. Potential methods of monetization. Our predecessor, Dennis Schwartz, told that DDoS as a service is an option, also paying ransom for stopping the DDoS attacks. And our experiments run like we monitored the comments with IPs, and then we try to reach those IPs, and we just see some web pages like online gaming, online casinos, e-shops, and forums. And this forum is probably connected with social engineering because of that section 0-day vulnerability. Okay, let's summarize what we have heard. Chinese flooding tools continue in tradition of DDoS attacks, but now they are ported to Linux operating systems. Pointing to XOR DDoS, we can say that the complexity of Linux Trojan has slightly increased, and we are talking about threats that happened in the past year. Actually, the good or fast development of these tools is supported by code sharing through Chinese forums. We see that online services are under attack, and those for which online availability is crucial. And the last point is that UPX-packed binaries that were coming from bot builders, they are a source of kind of polymorphism for the attackers. So we could say that perhaps there's an intentional AV evasion technique. And the question is that if it's right time to include the static unpacker for ELF UPX into AV engines, because it would be perhaps better to see that hidden content of these files. So, acknowledgement. We would like to thank Link Song from University of Iowa, who provided us an extensive number of samples that were caught on his honeypots, and also to Mr. Bankov, that is a Twitter handle, who provided us a list of active IPs of HFS servers. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. We have the time for one question. You're all shy tonight? Giovanni, you have a question. Oh, you were stretching. Okay. 1, 2, 3. Okay, thank you. Thank you very much.